It always takes a few seconds for people to enter. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I am Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. So glad to be with everybody this evening. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who is with us in the room. And the chat is also where you can add your questions, excuse me, throughout the program, and we will try to bring them into the conversation. A few words about JWA for anybody who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story will help us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in that. The book talks are just one aspect of the work that we do. I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore all the other wonderful resources and programs that we offer. A quick logistical note, if anybody would like captioning, you can click the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says CC, or it may say show captions, and that will turn them on for you. Okay, I am delighted to welcome our featured author for today. Alina Adams is the New York Times bestselling author of soap opera tie-ins, figure skating mysteries, and romance novels. She was born in Odessa, then the USSR, moved to the United States with her family in 1977. Her Regency romance, The Fictitious Marquis, was named a first Jewish #Own Voices historical by the Romance Writers of America. Her Soviet-set historical fiction includes The Nesting Dolls, My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, and the newly released Go On Pretending, which we will be discussing tonight, and which is chock full of story and so much fun. Welcome, Alina. We're so glad to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Judith. I really appreciate it.
So I really enjoyed this book. It was quite a page turner, and there is a lot going on in this story. There is really something for everyone. This is a generational saga. It covers a lot of different periods of history, from the Spanish Civil War to McCarthyism to the fall of the Soviet Union, all the way into the 21st century. The history of soap operas, interracial marriage, all kinds of sort of utopian settlements. And interestingly, all plot points that you have some personal experience with. So I'm curious where this project started for you. What was the sort of initial seed that brought you into this great story?
Well, as you mentioned in my introduction, I've written a lot of different things. I started by writing Regency romances, including The Fictitious Marquis, which ended up, I wrote it in 1994, and then 30 years later, I saw that the Romance Writers of America had named it the first Jewish Own Voices historical, which means it was the first time that a Jewish author had put Jewish characters into a Regency romance, which blew my mind. A friend of mine said to me, "You were a trendsetter." And I said, "I was an accidental trendsetter." It never occurred to me in 1994 that a Jewish author had never put Jewish characters into a Regency. Julia Quinn, who writes Bridgerton, which is, the hot show, she's Jewish, but
Yep.
she doesn't have Jewish characters in her books. And Georgette Heyer, who's sort of known as the godmother of Regency romance, she did have Jewish characters in her book, but she was also notoriously anti-Semitic, so you can imagine how well that went.
Yeah.
So I had written romance novels. I wrote contemporary romance novels. I wrote a figure skating murder mystery series because I used to work for ABC Sports in their figure skating department. I wrote soap opera tie-ins because I used to work for ABC Daytime, which is All My Children and One Life to Live General Hospital. Then I worked for Procter and Gamble Productions, which is As the World Turns and Guiding Light. And I only wrote my first historical fiction, Soviet set historical fiction. It came out in the year 2020. By the way, if anybody asks you, do you want to release a book during a pandemic? Go.
Yeah.
But it had already been scheduled. It was a July 2020 release. So, and that book took place in three different time periods. It took place in the Soviet Union in the 1930s during Stalin's Great Terror. Then it took place in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, which was during the Jewish Refusnik movement. And then in present day Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. And the feedback that I got from readers is they were really fascinated by the 1930s section because, as they said to me, for obvious reasons, Western Europe gets most of the press of the 1930s and the 1940s, and people had no idea what was going on in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe during that time. So when I did my second historical fiction novel, My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, I set the bulk of the story in the 1930s, which again was something that people did not know, that the first autonomous Jewish state of the 20th century was actually called Barabajan, and it was on the border of Russia and China because that great friend of the Jews, Joseph Stalin, decided that he would give the Jews their own homeland, of course, under the auspices of Joseph Stalin. And in that story, almost as a minor detail, is the fact that there were Americans who sold their property, whatever they owned in the United States, and moved to the Soviet Union. And the feedback I got from readers was impossible. That couldn't have happened. There's no way that could have happened. Now, one of the things that I like to make a distinction about is in My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, takes place in the 1930s. And you got to give people sort of their due in that it's the Depression,
Right.
and people are being told there's work in the Soviet Union. So you can see people packing up and leaving. But when I
It
was
was
doing
also a very idealistic time in a lot of ways. There were a
it
lot of
was,
people who were
and
caught
a
up
lot
in
of the
sort of
people
utopian dreams.
were the children of those who had left during the revolution because they were actually socialists, and without getting too much into the weeds of socialists versus communists during the revolution. So yes, this is, workman's circle. This is the Bund. This is all of that. So yes, in the 1930s. But because of the time period that I wanted to go on pretending in, it was the 1950s. And the 1950s is not the 1930s economically.
Right.
While not everyone was living a Leave It to Beaver lifestyle in the 1950s, the fact is the 1950s in America was a very affluent time. It was probably proportionally one of the most affluent times. So I had to think to myself, what reason would Americans in the 1950s have for moving to the Soviet Union? And then I looked around my house. And I saw my husband, who also lives there. My husband is African American. We have been married since 1999. But one of the things we like to say is by the time we got married, nobody cared. I mean, I'm sure there's people who care. I'm sure there's people in the year 2025 who care. But overall, by the time we got married in 1999, nobody cared. We have like right below us lives an interracial couple that got married 50 years ago. Back then, people cared.
Different story. Yeah.
Very different stories. So when you're talking about the 1950s, I thought, who would be swayed by the propaganda of the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union, which announced, we have outlawed racism, ergo, it doesn't exist. We have outlawed sexism, ergo, it doesn't exist. We have outlawed anti-Semitism, ergo, it doesn't exist. Who would buy that propaganda? And that would be a couple who are living in America in the 1950s. This is over a decade before Loving v. Virginia, which made interracial marriage legal in the United States, although it was legal in New York at the time. It wasn't everywhere. This was a couple where the woman was a professional woman. She was a writer. He is an actor. They were actually working on the same show. And then I thought, well, as long as I'm talking about entertainment, I'm going to talk about a genre I know a lot about, which is soap operas. I had worked for Procter & Gamble Productions, which produced Guiding Light, which started on the radio and then transitioned to television. And I thought, what if you have an African American man who has been playing a presumably white character on the radio? But now the show is making the transition to television. Well, what happens? I think we can all guess what happens. And what if the woman who was writing and producing the show, they were romantically involved, and she says, if he goes, I go. Okay, bye. So now here you have the two of them. They're an interracial couple in the 1950s. They both lost their jobs. They're trying to stage a Marxist version of Othello. And by the way, there actually are Marxist readings of Othello, starting with the fact that Iago actually has more lines than Othello. So who's really the hero? And is this a class parable? There's quite a bit of writing about that. And so they're trying to stage this show in New York and getting nowhere in both white theaters and black theaters, neither of whom is interested in having them there. And here comes an invitation for them to stage their version of Othello in the Soviet Union in 1957 for the World Youth Festival, as I like to refer to it. Yes, that time that the Soviet Union threw a pro-democracy festival. Now, once again, to put it into context, this was after Stalin. Stalin was dead, and Nikita Khrushchev had just taken office, and he did initiate what was called Khrushchev's thaw. He did open the country up to Western, at least Western visitors. He did try to give a little bit of freedom of speech. He did try to undo a lot of what Stalin had done. In fact, he even makes a speech at the 20th Communist Party Congress where he denounces Stalin and he talks about Stalin's camps and he talks about Stalin's arrest and all of that. So it is a brief window in the Soviet Union where they're holding this festival. And so they invite my two characters to come stage their show, and they treat them completely like celebrities. So they are actually insulated from what is going on in the country. The same way that African Americans like Paul Robeson, who made many, many visits to the Soviet Union. And in fact, when he received the Stalin Peace Prize, he was asked, well, what about your good friend, the actor Solomon Mikhalkov's, who had just been the official cause of death was that it was a car accident, but he had been arrested and beaten so badly they couldn't even have an open coffin. And Paul Robeson, who claimed that Mikhalkos was a great friend of his, receiving the Stalin Prize, says, I know nothing about it.
Mm.
So they're insulated and they come to this.
Though Jonas, your African American character, is he's picking up on some sense of what, I mean, he's seeing what's happening and he's excited about some aspects of their experience, but he is also not totally won over, I
Well,
think.
it's because he's not the true believer.
Right.
And this was the other challenge for me. As you read in my introduction, I was born in the former Soviet Union. So I have lived my entire life surrounded by people who were brutally traumatized by the Soviet regime. So to put myself in the head of a true believer was a fun challenge for me.
Yeah,
It
I'm
was
sure.
something that I wanted to do. Rose, my heroine, she believes the propaganda because she grew up in that New York socialist scene. At 17 years old, she runs off to Spain to fight with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. She is a true believer. Jonas, being an African American in the United States, knows that all politicians are lying. He knows that all promises are not going to be delivered on, but he's in love. And this actually is the part that makes my husband laugh because there was my husband once said to me after having read a lot of my books, he said to me, for you, the male characters are just something to hang your coat on. And I thought that was a perfect description. So now I refer to as my husband, the coat rack.
Mm,
Because yes, I have no shame in saying that I write women's fiction. I write women characters, and yes, the male characters are there to serve the female characters. You had said at the beginning we talk about women's roles and all of that stuff in fiction. It's not an accident, it's a choice. And yes, Jonas, the African American character, he sees through the Soviet Union. He sees that this is just as he keeps saying, 40 acres and a mule. We've heard it before. It's not going to happen, but he loves her, and she's the true believer. And in fact, the title, Go On Pretending,
right.
comes from the fact that she insists on seeing the world she wants to be true, regardless of what goes on around her.
Hmm.
And then she and Jonas decide to stay in the Soviet Union after the 1957 festival, and they have a daughter, Emma, who, because she is a native-born Russian speaker, hears and picks up on a lot of things that her parents can't, or in her mother's case, won't.
Right.
And then we have a character who I then, as an adult, through her very cynical eyes, see the Soviet Union right up through its collapse.
Right. One of the things I thought was really interesting is you have, as you said, Rose, who kind of insists on pretending that the world is as she would like it to be. And then there's sort of a counterpart to that in Jonas's parents. As you said, Jonas is perceptive about, he picks up on everything that's going on around him. But his parents, who follow the ideology of Booker T. Washington, live, not that they think the world is the way they want it to be. They're not naive the way that Rose is in some ways, but their approach to change is kind of this idea of like, if we act as dignified as possible and act as the way we want to be treated, then eventually that will bring that around. So he actually grows up very familiar with the act of pretending that you're living in a different world than the real one, which in some ways I think prepares him to live with someone like Rose.
It does. It does. I have gotten feedback in my first Soviet historical fiction, The Nesting Dolls, which is also a multi-generational saga. The youngest, the one who was born and grew up in America, she ends up dating an African American man. And as my oldest son said, I don't know why people think the characters are based on you and dad. Dad grew up in New York, went to private school, and then went to MIT. And Gideon, the character in the book, grew up in New York, went to private school, and went to Caltech. So clearly they are completely
Totally
different
different.
people. Yeah, he doesn't understand that. But when I wrote that, and it's a very small part of the Nesting Dolls, I got feedback saying two things. One, I don't understand how immigrant families work because no immigrant family would ever accept their daughter dating an African American man. And I also don't understand how interracial relationships work because my Black characters are articulate and educated. Oh, and this is my favorite part. They have interests outside of being Black. They don't just sit around all day thinking about how they are Black. They have other interests. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with Jonas and his parents was honestly write about not the cliches of African Americans that you see in media, but the African Americans that I know. My husband's parents both have master's degrees. They both, worked. One, his mother was a social worker. His father was a medical administrator. All of his siblings went to college and all of his friends. So I wanted to write about that milieu. But in order to do that, you had to address that there are people who got through the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. My husband's father grew up in Virginia under Jim Crow, but there was very much this idea of dignity and you behave as who you know you are. And eventually people will come around. And I know there's issues with that approach, but in a lot of ways, it's actually very similar to my Soviet grandparents, especially my mother's mother, who was very much of, she was very proud of the fact that her children did not speak Yiddish because that showed how assimilated they were and how modern they were. And so if they just kept behaving that way, eventually people would start treating them. So it was interesting to me how, even though my husband and I grew up in very, very different worlds, that attitude was similar. And I did give it to Jonas, regardless of whether people tell me I understand immigrant families or interracial relationships. When I told my cousin, I was on the phone with her, and I told her, a reader said that I don't understand immigrant families, and she laughed. And then I said, and they said I don't understand interracial relationships. And there was like dead silence on the phone. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, I wasted all the laughing on the first one. I didn't have
Right.
anything for the second one.
Right, exactly. You definitely need to have a lot of patience to be a writer, I guess. Um, so you cover so much historical ground, and I'm curious about what your research process was like, because as you mentioned, it's not that you're, a historian. You have done all this other kinds of work, but have figured out how to create the settings and the details of these particular times.
Well, one of the things that I always say is that historical fiction is the easiest thing in the world to write. It's the easiest genre because you don't have to make up what happened. It already happened. You just steal from history, and then all you have to do is create characters who respond to it. So, what I did when I decided I wanted to start with the world of soap operas, first and foremost, is also I like sharing the stories of women that people might not be aware of. So actually the book starts with the Spanish Civil War, and I do a little background on how women were in the military, actually on both sides, and how both sides of the Spanish Civil War used women politically against each other. So that's that part of it. But then when I got to the soap opera part, there's a woman by the name of Erna Phillips, who most people don't know she existed. She not only invented soap operas, most of the things that you think about television storytelling today, she invented that too. The cliffhanger,
Mm.
the concept of doing social issues, the concept of having stories led by women. Her shows in the 1930s, There's an expression that says every generation thinks they invented sex, but there's also every generation thinks that they invented diversity. And they think that they invented diversity, but when Erna Phillips was launching her shows in the 1930s, she had Jewish immigrant families and Irish immigrant families and Italian immigrant families. And in fact, her show, The Guiding Light, was among the first to have African American contract players. If you can believe it, at one point, The Guiding Light had under contract James Earl Jones, Billy
Hmm.
D. Williams, Cecily Tyson, and Ruby Dee.
Wow.
So all of the
Heavy
things,
hitters.
yeah, it's pretty impressive. All of the things that people sort of think of that television became, most of it was developed by Erna Phillips, who was a Jewish woman who was born in Chicago and wrote most of her shows out of Chicago. At one point, she was writing the equivalent of 40 novels a year because she had multiple shows on the air. And she was earning what I think in today's money would be over $1 million. She was one of the most successful television producers ever, as she invented the genre. So I took Erna Phillips and I made her a supporting character in the first section of Go On Pretending. So the research that I did was, having worked at P&G, I had actually a lot of access to her archives.
Hmm.
And I also
Cool.
worked at Procter and Gamble when they celebrated As the World Turns this 50th anniversary and Guiding Light's 70th. I want to say it was 70th. So I was involved in a lot of the writing, getting ready for those events. So, and Erna had left her papers in archives. So that was a lot of the research. And then when it came to the 1957 World Youth Festival, there actually is some footage of it, some black and white film reels. Growing up, I had heard very sort of passingly of the 1957 World Youth Festival, less about the festival and more about the fact that after the Soviet Union welcomed the world, 9 months later came the Children of the Rainbow.
Mm.
And the fact is that was not a great experience for children growing up because despite all that outlawed racism and anti-Semitism, shockingly, it was still there. Also, the idea actually came around backwards to me. My oldest son, he did an internship in Moscow in 2019, and my husband and our two younger children, we visited him there. We actually got in right under the wire 2019, not only before the pandemic, but before the Russia-Ukraine war. And he had spent a summer living there. And let's just say the responses that he got were not all of them, obviously not all the time. But for instance, he said to my husband when we visited, he said to him, make sure that you're always wearing a sports coat and a nice shirt because otherwise they might think you're an African immigrant here trying to steal their jobs.
Hmm.
So the concept of people of color in the Soviet Union was also interesting to me. So I was able to sort of enter it backwards,
Mm.
and I was able to use both the writings of the time and there is video, there's film footage, which is actually really interesting.
That's cool.
Especially they had the opening ceremonies there and on the streets. The song Moscow Nights, if people are familiar with the song Moscow Nights, it came from there. One of the most interesting things that I found is that in the middle of the World Youth Festival in Moscow, an American student from Harvard came to Moscow, and this is right after the uprising in Hungary of 1956, where the Soviet version was that fascists had tried to overthrow the current communist government, and Hungary begged the Soviet Union to come in and save them. The Hungarian version was it was a natural uprising to try to get rid of the communist government, and the Soviets came in and crushed it. So in 1957, so this is roughly a year after the Hungarian uprising, this American college student stood on the steps of Red Square, right at the front of Red Square, right where Lenin's mausoleum is, where he lays in pickled state. And he read from the United Nations report, which talked about the Soviet Union coming in. And it was all spontaneous. Crowds gathered and he was reading in English and people were translating the report on the fly into Russian and people were asking him questions about life in America. And to me, that was just such a incredible real life scene. As I said, I don't have to make something up. Guy
Right.
already did it. So that was
And it would be
fascinating.
hard to believe if it weren't real because as you're saying, it captures this moment when Russia was a little bit more open
Yeah,
than it became. So that you could imagine that would not have happened in another time on
right,
many different counts, right?
right.
Even
So
though
I
you
found
also
I
talk
found
about
it
how there were people who came in and, tried to discredit what he was saying.
right. There were actually professionals there from Hungary who were there handing out like reports to people to back up their version of it. But the fact that hundreds of people were gathering in Red Square to listen to this man showed about the hunger that they had for getting any kind of word from outside of their
Right.
country. And I found a report on that in like a Harvard Crimson had done a story on it. And then,
Wow.
you follow, when you research, you get one thing and you follow it from there and you follow it from there. So that was fascinating. And then later, when I get to the part of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I was actually old enough. And I remember I was in my teens, I think. Yeah, when that happened. So I remember my Russian is okay. I mean, I can definitely speak to my parents. When I worked for ABC Sports, I was the translator for the athletes, so my Russian is okay. My political Russian isn't great. But up to that point, I could sort of watch the news in Russian and understand it. And I remember during the coup, they put people on who were suddenly speaking in such obscure double talk that I remember saying,
Probably nobody could understand it.
yeah, no, I said to my mother, I don't understand it. I understand each word individually, but I don't understand what's going on. So I remember the confusion of those days. And I remember how there was there is a man named Vladimir Povsner who has actually a very interesting background. He had a Catholic mother and a Jewish father, and he was born in Paris. And they fled Paris during World War II, came to America. So he actually went to school in America. So his English was very good. He went all the way up through high school. He actually went to a high school that my husband and two of my kids actually ended up going to. And then because his father was a diehard communist, they first moved to East Berlin, and then they eventually moved to the Soviet Union. But because his English was so good, he became the official spokesperson for the Soviet Union. So anytime if you're like when the Soviet Union shot down the Korean jetliner, Povsner would have been the one on the air telling you, no, he didn't. They flew into their missile by
Mhm.
accident. And whenever anything happened, he and Phil Donahue did a lot of shows together. And Povsner so was the Soviet Union's chief apologist. And then maybe it just felt that way. Maybe in reality it didn't happen that way, but it literally felt like he was on the air talking about how wonderful the Soviet Union was. And then the Soviet Union fell. And in the middle of a sentence, he suddenly changed his tone and was now talking about all the terrible things that the Soviet Union had done. So I actually used him for another character, but I wanted to explain why that changed would have happened the way that it did. So a lot of my research was taking what had happened and then making up why it may have happened.
Mhm. Um, and it was really interesting also to see sort of represented within all these historical moments, these kinds of representatives of different approaches to ideology and social change. Like you have Rose, who, as we've already talked about, is like really locked in. She's like, I'm a diehard believer. I believe if I just believe hard enough, I can bring about a different world.
Which is very similar to what Jonas's parents were doing, just in a different way,
Exactly.
in a different time.
You have Emma, her and Jonas's daughter, and Emma's husband Dennis, who is the the Soviet media person, who are just totally cynical.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the book, you have this character Coop who comes in at the end, who I think represents a little bit of something different, like sort of. I don't know exactly how I would describe him, sort of like non-ideologically optimistic or something like that. Like, doesn't buy into one system, but kind of just like believes in humanity and, has isn't cynical, but also isn't naive.
Well, the other, talk about other research. So we had just come to America in 1977, and we came to San Francisco, and we were living in San Francisco. And I feel within a few months is when you had Jim Jones
Mm-hmm.
and Guyana, and it got a lot of play in San Francisco because his People's Temple had been in San Francisco. So Jim Jones was always sort of in my consciousness, and I've always been fascinated by cult leaders. I was fascinated what makes people follow someone who's clearly a lunatic. But,
Right.
they people followed him to Guyana and
Right.
then they took cyanide because he told them to. I mean, that's mind-blowing. So the background that I gave Coop was that he had been a child whose mother took him to Jonestown and some people did escape. So the fact is it's not, I didn't make that part up completely. I believe a few dozen people went
Right.
into the jungle a few days before because they knew something was happening. So I made him, gave him that background, which set him up for, okay, all political movements are nonsense. Everyone is a demagogue. Everyone is out for themselves, but you can still help individual people because the fact is that if you feed a hungry child, you've done something, and it doesn't matter what your politics are. It doesn't matter what the child's politics are. It doesn't matter what the child's parents' politics are. I, as a character, am going to do what I can to help people, and the politicians can figure it out for themselves. I don't care.
Right. Yeah. So it was very interesting, I think, to see these kinds of different ideological approaches like meshed in with the different historical moments. And I was curious if you were sort of like, okay, I need to represent all these different, sort of ideologies. If you sort of had your own sense of like, what is the message I want to put in here about like how does change actually happen, or sort of how you were thinking about making those cases.
Well, that's interesting because my publisher, after I sent him this manuscript, one of the first things he said to me, so what is your point here? What are you trying to say? And I think one of the things I'm a big believer, what was it that was it Sam Goldwyn of Metro Goldwyn Mayer who said if you want to send a message, use Western Union. I don't particularly, and people are probably not going, what's Western Union? That's a whole other thing. Um, I don't write books to send a message. I love telling stories. I love reading stories. So that's what I'm about. But I think if I was building to anything, because real life doesn't build to anything, narrative kind of has to. I think if I was doing that, it would be Coop's perspective. Stop worrying about what to label this.
Hmm.
Stop worrying about what movements this is. Stop trying to, and I mean, I think we see a lot of this today. Stop doing this ideological purity test. It's
Right.
this whole idea that I agree with you on one thing, I can't be with you on this one thing unless you agree with me on 13,000 other things. And it's not new. We're just seeing a lot of it today. So I think what I wanted to say is, just don't worry about what to call it. Don't worry if it's left wing. Don't worry if it's right wing. Don't worry if it's communist. Don't worry if it's libertarian. Just, live a good life and be good and let the other pieces fall where they may. So I think that is a lot of what I was trying to say without deliberately trying to say it, but
Right.
I needed a thread.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's, yeah, and especially because the end of the book, and you're writing about something that is still kind of an ongoing story. The end of the book finds your characters in this autonomous region in the northern part of Syria. Is it pronounced
It's
Rojava?
it's Rojava. And
Rojava.
actually, I was told this by one of my kids, who is a self-described anarchist. He is the one who brought Rojava to my attention. He got me a book on the subject of it. It's actually fascinating. So here we have in Syria and Kurdistan, we have a women's revolution. We have a movement that, again, it's basically classic libertarianism if you break it down. But again, let's take the labels out of it. The fact is, there are women who are in the Middle East who are holding off ISIS, which is
Totally
phenomenal. It's a
insane. Yeah.
people's revolution. It's run by very local councils. It's not centralized. It's mostly women in roles of leadership, and they are holding off ISIS. And so to me, Rose's granddaughter, Emma's daughter Libby, who has grown up on her grandmother's stories of rushing off to Spain and she's so inspired by it that this becomes her movement, and she runs off to Syria, and her mother is not pleased about this. And she blames Rose because she says, you filled her head with all this nonsense, and I let you because it was nonsense, and I didn't think there was going to be anything negative. You told her your stories, and you sung her your little socialist songs, and I'm like, whatever, because it's all meaningless. But now my 19-year-old daughter has run off to fight in a revolution, and we're going to go get her. And you know what? You're coming with me because you're the one who gave her this idea. You're the one who's going to bring her back.
Well, let's talk about the mothers and daughters here because there are so many interesting models of motherhood here. I mean, that was a classic, sort of like mama bear kind of. In fact, there is also a story, a real bear, real
There's
mama
bears
bear story,
too.
but
There's
you know,
actual bears.
actual bears, but of just sort of like, I think lots of Jewish mothers would probably threaten, like, if you do that, I'm gonna hunt you down and come back and get you. And Emma actually does it. But you have these kind of interesting models because you have Rose, who in some ways is doesn't have a particularly close or easy relationship with her daughter because she's sort of so wrapped up in her relationship with her husband and her relationship with the Soviet Union, and then you have Emma, who is really trying to be a different kind of mother to her daughter and navigate her relationship with her own mother. And there's a little bit of Rose's mother too at the beginning.
Well, at one point, I actually have Emma thinking to herself about her Rose's priorities. She says Rose's priorities are first Jonas, always her father, then her work, then her politics. Then she goes, then Emma. She's like, yeah, let's pretend I'm number four, because it is very much an a. Again, remember how I said I didn't want to do the cliches in the African American family? I didn't want to do Jewish cliches either, and it's a little too easy to do that. So I wrote about Rose, who first and foremost was her relationship. In fact, at one point, her daughter Emma says to her, you know, not everyone, mom, lives their life in a mutual admiration society where they think the other person is the greatest who ever lived. And Rose says, well, they should. So for Rose, very much her relationship is first. And then there's her work. She really loves her work. She's a writer, she's a director. She loves what she does. She doesn't apologize for that. She doesn't pretend it's not true. Her politics are less tangible. It's just in the sense that, she dragged them to the Soviet Union. So there's that piece of it. There's the blinders she has
Right. She
on
denied
about
their
what she
reality
sees.
in some ways. Yeah.
Right. And then she loves her daughter, but her daughter is not the center of her universe. And her daughter grows up understanding that. And I'm actually going to tell you something now that I've been doing a lot of talks for this book for this book, but this hasn't come up. But this is something I've been thinking a lot about. People have been asking me because I write a lot about mothers and daughters. The Nesting Dolls is about three generations of women. So is My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region. And people have been asking me, are the mothers and daughters and Go On Pretending based on your own life and your own relationship with your mother? And the short answer is no. My mother's a wonderful human being, but she's not like any of the characters that I've written. And we have a very good relationship, but it's not at all like that one. I realized, this was after I had written three books, I realized that I did not write the mother that I had. I wrote the mother that I was afraid I was.
Hmm.
And I will explain that. So, my husband and I'm sure our children would say, are way too wrapped up in each other, as my daughter will periodically go by. In fact, there was one point where my husband had COVID. And so he had to isolate in another room. I mean, he wasn't isolating that much, he was just in another room. And it wasn't until that time that I realized how I'm constantly touching him.
Hmm.
It wasn't until I couldn't that I had to stop myself that I realized I'm constantly touching him to the point where we'll sit and we'll watch TV and we'll be holding hands and our daughter will come by and go, ew. So, there was that piece of it. And in fact, my husband and I talk about how we sometimes worry that we're setting too high of a bar for our
Hmm.
kids when it comes to relationships. Our kids are 25, 21, and 18. Our daughter's a senior in high school. And on the one hand, I think we're showing them a very good, very positive relationship. But on the other hand, we're kind of setting a really, really high bar. So that's something that I was concerned about. Second part, I love what I do professionally. I love writing. I love talking about writing. I love going to bookstores to talk about writing. I have never said to my kids, you are the most important thing in my life. Because while they're incredibly important, I don't know, are they fourth like Emma? I don't think so. It's difficult to say, which is why I think I realized that the mother I wrote was not the mother I have, but the mother I'm really afraid I am. So I was working through some
Working it
stuff.
through, right? Exactly. Working through the other piece of it. Um, I have a question about writing, actually. Um, because I was curious as someone with the background in soap operas. We've talked already about how the your experience with, your background in soap operas influenced some of the content of the book and the history of the book, and that piece is fascinating, and it was exciting to see Erna Phillips in there. She is, we have her in the Jewish Women's Archive as well, so I'm always excited when some of the folks who we might know about make it out into other
I think
shows.
she deserves to be known much broader than
Yeah.
she is because she should be up there with the pioneers with, Pat Weaver and everybody else who basically invented the early days of television.
Right, exactly. So, but I'm curious also as a writer, sort of how does that background, when you're writing things that are not in that genre, how do you think about, do you think about writing differently? Is it a different kind of process? Are there sort of similar ways that you think about writing in the different genres that you write?
Well, first and foremost, the best part about writing books versus writing for soaps is I don't have a budget. I
Mm,
don't have to worry about can we afford to shoot in the Soviet Union? Yes,
right.
we can. In fact, we can go back in time. That's what we can do. So that's the best part. In fact, when I worked for P&G, I did a lot of what's called transmedia. I did things around the show, like I wrote tie-in books, but I also I did the website. I did things like writing letters that characters wrote to each other. Basically, if it happened off screen, that's the stuff that I was in charge of writing. So it was super fun because on the show, they're limited by budget. On mine, it's like they're all on a jet going to Paris. I can
Right.
do that. So that was the first part.
Sort of
This,
like your own internal fan fiction.
yeah, exactly. But it was officially sanctioned. I have
Right.
the paperwork. So that was one part of it. So I'm not limited the way that soap writers are. But here's the thing. I do not think that melodrama is a bad word. I think melodrama is great. I'm a big fan of things happening. In fact, I like to say I'm of the Alice in Wonderland school of reading. What is the point of a book without dialogue and pictures? I like dialogue. I do not want to read a three-page description of a chair, no matter how wonderful it may be. I want something to happen. In fact, when I ask about a book, I want to know what happens in it,
Hmm.
what's it about. So when I write my books, I write them as if it were a soap in the sense that something has to happen in every scene. If it's something's not happening in every scene, why is that scene there? So I think having worked in soaps for about 30 years, I actually think it really affected my fiction well because it forced me to constantly be telling a story. I mean, I like James Joyce. I didn't like James Joyce until I realized that he was written for the ear, not for the eye. You have to listen to James Joyce, but I am not going to have an entire chapter of a character wandering around Ireland.
Right. Yeah. And I think that is very clear because, as I said at the very beginning, it's like you get caught up in the story and it just kind of carries you.
That's the
Um,
plan. That's the
yeah.
plan. I want to write books. Actually, I like to say that my goal is to write what I call airplane books. And here is my goal. If you are on a 9-hour flight and reading my book makes it feel like a 4-hour flight, that's my goal. I have no lofty literary ambitions beyond that.
Though I could also imagine that there's a different way that you have to think about narrative arcs because you're not sort of writing for the endless kind of
Yeah.
loops. Like there has to be a little bit more of a framing and beginning and end because you're not
Right.
trying to extend it out. And uh,
And I'm a plotter. People always say, are you a plotter or a pantser? I'm definitely a plotter. I write my first few chapters without knowing where I'm going because that's how I get to know the characters and where I'm going. But usually after about chapter 3, I have a very detailed outline chapter by chapter and within each chapter, scene by scene. And it's only one line. It's like what the point of it is, but I'm very much of a plotter. I need to know where I'm going in every scene, or else because of my love of dialogue, I can go off and I can just write witty banter for 7 pages. But if I don't know where I'm going, it's not going to be very good.
right. Um, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but it was interesting to me that you chose to have that, speaking of sort of bookends, that you chose to have that starting place in this with the Spanish Civil War because that is sort of the frame, but then you leap ahead and it takes really till the end until you get back to that. There's sort of some, hints dropped along the way that some things happened there that were traumatic, but you kind of don't get back there until the very end. And I was curious why it was important for you to start the story there if really the bulk of the story wasn't, you know. wasn't taking place in that time period.
Well, here's actually, it's an excellent question, and here's a very fun story about that. That prologue did not exist in the manuscript that I turned in to my publisher. It started with just the message from the 19-year-old daughter saying, I'm off to Rojava, and Emma going to Rose and saying, you did this, you're going to fix it. And then we went back to the. Here's why that prologue is there. Originally, it was more of a mystery of what happened at the Spanish Civil War, and it remains a mystery throughout the whole thing. But here's what my publisher said. He said the story starts in it's the 1950s. It's Madison Avenue. Yes, it has some serious themes like interracial romance, but it's a soap opera. It's kind of light. It's kind of frothy. And then he says, and then we're in a civil war in Syria. It just seems too intense, and he didn't think that it was set up well enough. And when he gave me that note, and the letter that the editor sends you, the long, everything is great. Here's 900 pages on what I'd like you to change, but it's great. But let's change all that. So when I got the editor's letter, so there was a movie in the 1970s. There's a movie in the 1970s that I don't remember the name of it, but it had Susan Sarandon and Robert Redford, and they were pilots. They were like stunt pilots in the 1920s. Like, they would stand out on the wings and wacky things would happen. And I remember reading about it that the first half of the movie was just, wacky romantic comedy. It's Robert Redford and Susan Sarandon. And then halfway through the movie, she's on the wing doing their stunt flying, and he reaches out to grab her and he misses,
Oh my
and she
God.
plummets to her death. And the feedback that they got from audiences was, how did we suddenly pivot from this wacky romantic period comedy to dead Susan, especially Robert Redford. Robert Redford in the 1970s didn't save Susan Sarandon. And the studio went in and they recut the movie, and they tried to put in the beginning, like in the opening credits, they put all these shots of plane crashes so that people would sort of be prepared for the darkness to come. It still didn't work. The movie still failed, but I remembered that story. And so when my publisher made the point about how it needs some darkness in the beginning to tell you where it's going, I thought I will dramatize the Spanish Civil War, which was not dramatized in the original version. It was just Rose talking about it, and it was established that something had happened there that she's keeping a secret. That, of course, I love family secrets, again, from soaps, and I'm a big reader of multi-generational family sagas and all of that. So a juicy family secret. You put juicy family secret on the cover, I'm buying your book. That's just that's the secret. If anybody wants to sell to just me, publishers,
Right.
that's the deal. So, but I thought I would dramatize parts of the Spanish Civil War because it would set up the fact that later on we're going to end up in Syria and things are going to get pretty dark. So, excellent question.
Yeah, no, I was very intrigued by that because it also, it was an interesting sort of bookend, and also, it brings in this other historical period, and you do have that kind of parallelism to the contemporary piece. Um, and speaking of endings, one of the things that is a theme throughout the book is that Rose really believes it's always possible to write a happy ending. It's part of her sort of like insistence that she can create the world that she wants to see, or if she can't create it in actual life, she can create it on the page in her, or on the
Right. When
stage.
she first interviews with Erna Phillips asks her why soap operas, why not something else? She says is because there's always a chance to fix it tomorrow. That's the thing about soaps. That's the thing I love about soaps too, is that no matter how dire things seem on Friday, there's always the opportunity to fix it on Monday. And again, while I try not to get too heavy with the metaphors, because I don't think that's necessary, that is what Rose believes. She believes there's no situation that she can't write herself out of because you can always change what's going to happen.
So I was curious about your relationship to happy endings. I mean, this book it's not clear exactly, some things are resolved, but some things are not resolved. So I wouldn't say that this is a writing into a happy ending necessarily, but I was curious about your relationship with that. In your own writing, do you feel like you like to hold out that possibility for to be able to write a better resolution?
To me, the happy ending is the fact that you can always turn things around.
Hmm.
That's the happy ending. It's not the happy ending, it's the possibility of a happy ending. And in all of my characters, and actually in my own life, and I tie this back. I was actually just telling someone this in another interview, is that, being an immigrant and being mostly surrounded my whole life by immigrants, I was surrounded by people where it wasn't blatantly stated, it was just taken for granted. If you're in a situation that you don't like, do something about it.
Right.
And that's because that's what every single immigrant does. By definition, an immigrant is the person who says this situation is untenable. I'm going to try to change it. Now, it doesn't work for everyone, but the fact is that was just a given in my world and in my life. And so I try to live that way and I try to raise my kids that way. And it naturally bleeds into my fiction. Idea, oh, you're unhappy about something? What are you going to do to fix it? And that's the happy ending. The happy ending is the knowledge that you can always change it. Now, it doesn't always work out. And sometimes, there's a line like from I used to love this television show called Soap. It was a sitcom in the 1970s. And one of the characters says, "It's so nice to have so many choices. I just wish one of them were good." Because sometimes that does happen, but just knowing that no matter what, even if it's a matter of changing your perspective, if you can't change the circumstances, that to me is a happy ending. That's the happy ending. The
Mhm.
knowledge that you can always, always try to change your situation.
I love that. I mean, it very much aligns, I think, with how JWA thinks about history, which is that we're not only we're, of course, we want to honor the stories of history, and we think that you know, there's a lot of important context and lessons to learn from it. But one of the most important things we learn from history is that we are all history makers, that we all have historical agency.
Mhm.
And sometimes that looks like history writ large, the way we think of traditional history. Sometimes it looks like you make dinner for your family, or the small
Mhm.
acts of daily life that also move our lives forward. And part of our mission is really about helping people understand that we are all able to make history. And so it's that exact thing that you're talking about. Like, if you have agency, that maybe you will change the world, maybe you will just touch one person's life, maybe you
Maybe you
will
will just
create
change your own,
change
it's
your
that
own
whole
life.
thing.
Exactly.
Change your mind, change your life. Even
Mhm.
that, if you can just, even if you can just look at your situation through a different perspective, that's agency. That's something you can do.
Exactly. Our audience has been very quiet in the chat. I have not received any questions. So if you have any questions, pop them in there because we're nearing the end of the hour. I know your book only came out a few weeks ago, but I'm curious what the reception has been, especially I was thinking from other Jews from the former Soviet Union, because in your novel you represent Soviet Jews as always taking issue with all versions of events. Always ready to argue with how something is portrayed. So I'm curious whether you find that in your own readership, that there are folks who are saying, "Well, this isn't actually how I recall it happening," or "This is not the right representation," or anything else.
Well, remember how I was told I didn't understand how immigrant families work or anything else. So with my previous books as well, I don't pretend to speak for all immigrants, just like no one can speak for all women or all Jews or anything else. So of course, there's always people who are going to say, that's not how it was for me. I believe you. I'm not trying to write your story. I'm not even trying to write my story. I'm writing the story of Go On Pretending. So, yes, when you write about an experience that's so intimate and so personal, you're not going to capture everybody's experience. And I'm not trying to. And I'm actually always of the belief that if you try to tell the story of 5,000 people, you tell no one's story. If you tell the story of one person, you kind of tell everybody's. So, yes, in my previous book, My Mother's Secret, a novel of the Jewish Autonomous Region, I address the fact that there were rumors right up until the time Stalin died that he was planning to deport the entire Jewish population to Siberia, which is where Barabajan was. Now, I was not there, but people who have gone through the archives, because after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was like a treasure trove of history, find no evidence that he was planning to do this. Now, have two things to say about that. First is that even if something is a rumor, I think it tells you about what was going on in the country that people believed that it could be true. So that's important. And the other thing is that there are people who I mean, I used to give these talks when I spoke about my mother's secret, and I would address that. And there were people who came up to me afterwards, people in their 70s and 80s saying, "No, I remember. I saw the cattle cars that were being planned," or said, "I was beaten up on the street and they said to me, 'Oh, you Jews, we're going to deport you.'" And the fact is, I'm not even talking about the Mandela effect, but I'm talking about the fact that if people believed this was possible, that it was 1953, and the Jews of the Soviet Union really believed that Stalin was planning to put them all on cattle cars and ship them to Siberia, that tells you a lot about the time period, even if it wasn't true.
For sure. Yeah. And right, if you live in a place where you can't rely on, where truth has no meaning, then
Yeah.
all that's really true is what people believe is possible to be true.
Exactly. So when I write about a particular experience, people don't care that the internal record shows that it didn't happen. The fact is they felt it, and so to them, it did happen.
Right. And we know that the records are incomplete.
Yes. Yes.
Um, I know this book just came out, so no rush, but any ideas for what you might work on next?
Well, I'm actually taking a very different tack for my next one. I've been mired in Soviet history for quite a while. So, what my agent is actually currently shopping around is because I live in New York City and I write a lot about education in New York City, and it's such a mess that I'm actually, my agent is shopping around a comical mystery novel, which is called An NYC Schools Mystery, which is very different in that it takes place in a very different milieu, and it actually has some Soviet contact in it, but I'll leave that as a surprise. But I'm trying something completely different. It's set in the world of New York City elite school admissions, and it's a straightforward murder mystery.
Awesome. That sounds really fun. Well, we will look forward to that. And I mean, I knew that New York City school admissions was dark, but I didn't know it got as dark as murder. So,
Well, once again, remember, things happen and then I make stuff up on top of
right.
that.
Right. Well, we hope that we'll get to see that one soon. Thank you so much, Alina, for this conversation and for your book, which was a pleasure. I see some folks in the chat are requesting it from their libraries, which is great. I hope that they'll be able to get their hands on it soon.
Right, that's actually something I want to tell people that if you want to support an author, requesting the book from your library is a great way to do it because it only takes a few people, like 3 or 4 people need to request a book and they will go ahead and they will order it. Also, to support writers, leave reviews on Goodreads or on Amazon or anything else. And by the way, this because my last book came out during COVID. And I couldn't, not my last one, actually, my first Soviet Jewish one. What I came up with was since I can't sign your book, if people would like a signature, if they would like to email me at alinaadams@gmail.com, I have a very simple email, and just tell me who to sign the book to. I can sign a book plate and pop it in the mail for you, and we will pretend we had a genuine human interaction. But it's very simple. And also, sometimes people say, "Can you sign it for my mother? Can you sign it for my daughter?" Just tell me who to sign it to and your mailing address and I'll pop a book plate in the mail. It's alinaadams@gmail.com. My website is alinaadams.com. I also have a Substack. Again, Alina Adams. I'm not very creative. So I really love hearing from readers and I love hearing people's own stories because one of the things when I talk about Soviet Jewish history, people say, "Oh, yes, my mother told me this or my grandmother told me that." I love hearing people's stories. I'm just really a yenta at heart. So I really want to hear your stories.
I think Yentas make the best fiction writers because that's
Well, I mean, I was that little kid who, when the adults are talking and gossiping, I'd sit in the corner really quietly, hoping they wouldn't notice that I was listening.
I was the same. I was often under the table or listening around the corner in the other room, and I became a historian, you became a
And,
fiction.
and here we
It's
are
all pretty
today.
much the same, exactly. Well, I hope people will also discover more at JWA, some things related to our conversation tonight. In our Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, you can learn more about Erna Phillips, who we already discussed, about Emma Goldman, who was deported back to the Soviet Union and whose name comes up in the book, and about Jews and communism in the US, which is some good background to some of the things that happen in this novel. In our oral history collection, you can listen to stories from the Soviet Jewry movement. We have a whole collection there, and so much more. Please join us next week, same time, same place, for a conversation with Tova Mervis about her new novel, We Would Never, which Alina, you would like because it has some good family secrets in there. Um, and until next time, wishing everybody a good week. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, everyone, and may it be a good week.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate people taking the time.
Thank you so much, Alina, and happy Shavuot for anyone celebrating. Take
Good
care.
night.
Bye bye.